And I'm going to broadcast in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, attendees who are flowing in. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will begin our webinar shortly at 3 o'clock. We'll just wait for a few more to join us. Hi, and welcome to those folks joining us. We're going to wait for about 30 more seconds before beginning the webinar, just to let a few more attendees join the call before we get started. Okay, we'll get started. Hello and welcome. This is the first of the Ryerson City Building Institute's Urban Innovation Cafe webinar series. My name is Claire Nellisher. I'm a project manager at the City Building Institute at Ryerson. This is the first in our webinar series where we will be bringing together Ryerson faculty along with Toronto-based journalists and experts and advocates to discuss some of the urban design and policy challenges that have emerged through and been exposed through the COVID-19 pandemic and how we might begin to address them. So I have a few housekeeping notes before we get started. The basic agenda for today is that we will have 40 minutes of discussion followed by 10 minutes of a moderated Q&A. The audience mics and cameras will be off for the duration of our discussion, but we invite you to submit your questions to our panelists using the Q&A function at any time during the call. We won't be taking questions on Twitter, but we invite you, if you're tweeting along, to tag us at RyersonCBI. And if you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat function to contact the host. This webinar, along with others in this series, will be available shortly on our website with the Ryerson City Building Institute. So getting right into it. Today, our discussion focuses on the City of Toronto's recently announced ActiveTO plan, which we've been seeing rolling out in neighborhoods and on streets across the city over the past few weeks. Through COVID-19, we've really seen a lot of the existing inequalities in our city amplified and have disproportionate impacts on the most vulnerable in our communities. And we're also seeing that when it comes to streets. So we know that streets are critical for facilitating access and mobility, but they can also be places where racial and socioeconomic inequities are exacerbated and very visible. And so I think in this moment, we're really called to think to reflect on our past efforts for safe and open streets and our ongoing efforts, and to ensure that our COVID recovery programs that respond to streets really, like ActiveTO, are helping us move forward towards equity and safety for all road users. So those are some of the topics that you'll be discussing today in our conversation, which is going to be led by Matt Elliott. And Matt has been following this issue very closely. You may have seen his tweets and his newsletters and his charts. So Matt is an award-winning journalist whose work focuses on Toronto City Council and Toronto City Hall, and in Matt's words, nerdy policy stuff. Matt currently writes a weekly column for the Toronto Star, and he publishes City Hall Watcher, which is an influential newsletter about municipal issues. Matt has been a professor at Humber College in the Bachelor of Journalism program since 2014, and you can follow Matt on Twitter at @graphicmatt. So now I'll pass it over to Matt to introduce the panelists and get the conversation started, but just one last reminder to please keep submitting your audience questions through the Q&A box. So over to you, Matt.
Hey, thank you, Claire, for that introduction. And thank you, everybody, for being here today. Don't worry, my hair was like this before the pandemic. And I want to get started by going right into panelist introductions. I would appreciate it if everybody would applaud after I introduce the panelists. We will not be able to hear your applause, but I feel like we'll be able to feel it. We'll feel the good vibes. So I want to start with Dr. Raktim Mitra. He's an associate professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning and co-director of Transform Laboratory at Ryerson University. His research focuses on walking and cycling in urban and suburban neighborhoods, and that's why we brought him here today. Welcome.
Very happy to be here.
All right, continuing on, our next panelist is, you know this next panelist, she's always on YouTube answering questions from politicians. Our next panelist is Barbara Gray. She's the General Manager of Transportation Services at the City of Toronto. She's led initiatives such as the King Street Transit Pilot, our renewed Vision Zero 2.0 plan, the Complete Streets Policy Initiative, and the rollout of the 10-year Cycling Network Plan. Recently, a whole bunch of plans that all seem to end in TO. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Continuing on, our third panelist is Michael Longfield. He is the interim executive director at Cycle Toronto. He's a passionate cyclist, which is good because you'd expect that of the executive director at Cycle Toronto. He's a passionate cyclist for commuting and recreation. He's inspired by making cycling safe and inclusive. Welcome, Michael. And last but not least, we have Amanda O'Rourke. She's the executive director of 880 Cities, a nonprofit organization that brings people together to create more inclusive and human-centered public space in cities. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
All right. Before we get to the questions for our esteemed panel here, I wanted to do a very, very quick overview of what ActiveTO is. I assume that most people watching probably have a rough idea, but never hurts to go over really quickly. So ActiveTO launched last month in response to the need for people to keep active in the city, even during this time of physical distancing. It has three major components. So we have the quiet streets, which are residential streets that are partially blocked off to try to, create more space for people to walk. I think we have a map of that we can show, maybe not. Oh, there we go. There's the map of quiet streets from the City of Toronto. The second component of ActiveTO is the weekend closures to car traffic of a few roads. So this weekend, that'll be Lakeshore West, Lakeshore East, and my favorite is Bayview Avenue because it's close to my house. But those streets are shut down, so you can go for a nice long bike ride or a long walk and not have to worry about cars intruding on your good times. And the third component of ActiveTO is the newest component, was the bike network that was approved last week with a 23-2 vote at council. 25 new kilometers of bike lanes, bringing the total for 2020 to about 40 kilometers of bike infrastructure being installed. And we have a map of that as well that we can pop right up here just so you can get an idea of what we're looking at. Soon, maybe?
It's coming.
Look at that. So those are the road closures. You can see the mayor there giving a nice thumbs up. And here are the bike lane installations that were approved last week. So yeah, the three major components, the quiet streets, the road closures on weekends, and the bike infrastructure. We'll be talking about all three of these as part of our discussion today. So let's just dive right into questions here. I wanted to start with the notion that, when we talk about bike lanes and infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists, there's sometimes the conversation gets divided. There's this notion that this is for recreation, for people to have a chance to get outside. And exercise, but there's also this notion that this is for mobility and transportation. This is about, people commuting, getting groceries, getting to work. Mobility patterns have changed a lot in Toronto. The graph on your screen right now is from Apple and shows the just drop in driving, walking, and public transportation since this pandemic started. So we've seen some pretty significant changes to the way people in Toronto are moving. So I'm just curious what your view is of the balance of this plan. Is this a plan for recreation, or is this a plan for transportation, for mobility, for getting around to do the day-to-day basics of life? And I want to start with Barbara Gray.
I had a thought you might start with me. So that's a great question. I think it's both. Not to be all-inclusive and all, but I do think it's both. We've been following really closely the direction for the medical officer of health, and we've certainly got a lot of pressure sooner than we were able to roll out in order to make more space available for physical distancing for people, just for recreation, to get out for a walk every day, but also to do their basic shopping, wait to get into a store, etc. And as the public health guidance changes, we've tried to be quite responsive to that. So I think it's fair to say that the closures to cars on Bayview and the Lakeshore are clearly for recreation. And we saw how the Martin Goodman Trail and the other trails and ravine systems in the vicinity were really quite jammed on the weekend. We're paying attention to the volumes there to see if there's anything else we need to do during the week, but right now the trail seems to be managing during the week. So those for recreation, quiet streets, I think for both, people to get out and get out in their neighborhood where there's perceived or links to parks. So probably recreation there as well, predominantly. And then ActiveTO is mostly to give people space for physical distancing in neighborhoods.
Makes sense. Thank you. And I don't think saying both is a cop-out. It's it's two components, so it works. Raktim, you've done some research on, places to play. So, when you look at ActiveTO as a balance between, getting outside and having a good time versus getting outside and getting places, how's the plan strike you so far?
I think at least there's a good intention behind striking a balance between both recreation and transportation needs, as Barbara has mentioned. And I particularly want to focus on the quiet street component of ActiveTO initiatives. And as we know that summer is starting, schools are closed, all the camps and recreational activities are closed, and parents as well as children are getting anxious about what to do in this good weather. And I think in this context, quiet streets and urban streets in general offers a great opportunity for children and parents to come out and be active and socialize, as well as engaging in some physical activity. And we were discussing this the other day, that historically streets have been places to play for children for over the past century. But as we began to design our streets for automobiles, slowly we engineer children out of the streets. And this is a great opportunity to bring children back to urban streets. I know Barbara has championed this before her Toronto life in the US. And also she supported some pilots that happened in the past couple of years in Toronto. So it's great to see that that's being implemented at a much larger scale. Although I'd like to see this at a more geographically diverse scale, but at least it's a good start.
That makes sense, a good start. Amanda O'Rourke, 880 Cities has done a lot of work on this, a lot of demonstrations as to what streets can look like if they're changed into complete streets. Your thoughts on ActiveTO and the balance so far?
Yeah, so I think talking about balance is kind of a little bit of like a false dichotomy in a way, positioning it as transportation versus recreation. I think, to agree with Barbara and the other panelists, like it is really about both. And I think that, you know, what we would love to see the conversation really focus on is how to prioritize, you know, linking to what Claire mentioned at the top, how to prioritize the most vulnerable road users on our streets, and really thinking about how that intersects with both transportation and recreation. And when we say most vulnerable road users, we really mean people who are at most risk of harm on our streets. And that really means looking at racial violence, it looks at gender-based violence, it looks also at traffic violence. So safety is all of those components, and how do we actually frame the conversation so that we're thinking about the people who have the most at stake in this game, but have also the most to benefit by improving our streets.
Michael, the cycling component of this plan, you know, is it you know, about getting people out on the weekends to go for a bike ride, or is this about addressing people who need to commute from, you know, home to work or to get groceries or whatever?
Yeah, I feel like you know, we're maybe disappointing the people listening to this webinar that we're maybe expecting a vigorous debate, but I think we're all in agreement on this, that the framework of ActiveTO, I think one of the advantages to it is that it's identifying both and addressing both. I think, as Claire said at the beginning, that the pandemic has really been sort of highlighting the existing inequities, that they've been amplified. And, you know, on the first weekend of the major road closures, you know, like a lot of people, I had the opportunity to go down and wanted to check it out for myself. And I, you know, think of myself as a, you know, fairly cynical advocate sometimes, but I was shocked just the number of people out riding, smiling, kids, men, women. You know, it wasn't just a bunch of, you know, white privileged advocates out there. It was a really diverse mix. And I think the mayor said it best when it was you know, I think he said that it was a good time to be a politician because people were smiling and they were happy. And I think it's a really good way forward to seeing more success with the rest of the ActiveTO rollouts, just getting this kind of buy-in.
Yeah, absolutely. You've all mentioned, I think, in your answers a little bit about inequity and the geography of the plan. So that's a good seg into the second question I want to ask you. Last week, we got a neighborhood level map of COVID cases in Toronto, and you can see that on the screen now. And it was striking, I think, for most of us who know the city well, to see how concentrated the cases are in neighborhoods with lower incomes, neighborhoods with, you know, certain kinds of built form, neighborhoods where you might see more people working jobs that were not sort of made work from home because they can't be made work from home during the last couple of months. You know, when you look at this map and think about how COVID-19 has revealed and exacerbated many racial and socioeconomic issues in the city, you know, how should this map and this data shape ActiveTO now and as it continues to evolve over the coming months? Raktim, I want to start with you on this one.
Sure. As we all know, in terms of where or how people's travel behavior would change as an aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic is very fluid. We can make guesses, but no one knows how this will evolve. What we can guess is that overall we can see a dip in the number of trips being made. Certainly commute trips, not sure about non-commute ones. Of course, transit ridership, at least for the medium term, would go down. And at the same time, I understand there may be a rise in localized trips. Now, of course, in different communities, the impacts would be different, as you mentioned, Matt, that in the peripheries of Toronto, there are people who are low income, working precarious jobs, cannot work from home, many of them. And at the same time, the transit ridership or dependence on transit among those communities are higher than what we would expect in some other more inner city communities. So I think a good question now would be, how do we strike a balance where communities who would be captive users of transit in the post-COVID recovery time would still benefit from programs like ActiveTO. And I think this creates an opportunity for us to be creative and promote, transportation options that are more sustainable and healthier. Encouraging bicycling is one of those. If we reduce transit dependency in some areas of the city by enabling more bicycling, more walking, that benefits people in both downtown and suburban areas. I think we have to keep that broader picture in mind, and kind of use this opportunity to both mitigate health risks in the short and medium terms, but in the longer term, use this opportunity to, help people make more sustainable transportation choices as they try to adjust to the new transportation realities after the post-COVID time.
Amanda, your organization does a lot of stuff. Sometimes there's this accusation that like the complete street stuff, the ActiveTO stuff, it's a downtown thing and not a suburban thing. The data shows COVID hitting the inner suburbs pretty hard. What do you, when you look at that map, how does that shape your thinking on ActiveTO?
Yeah, I mean, I think Raktim hit it on the first question, thinking about the geography of the city. As the city extends ActiveTO, there definitely needs to be a focus on reaching the communities that most need access to these transportation choices. So we know that the communities in the inner suburbs are more likely to be using transit. The communities that are opting out or have the luxury of opting out of using transit tend to be whiter, wealthier. They tend to have more access to working from home opportunities. So how in the next sort of generation of ActiveTO, how do we prioritize the essential workers? How do we prioritize people who need the safe spaces to get to where they need to go, to not only address the fact that we're in a pandemic, and our focus right now as our medical officer of health has been directing us and providing great leadership on is, our priority is still in saving lives here. So how do we address access to safe and sustainable transportation choices for people who are most in need? So I think that is going to be the biggest priority, and it's a big job for the transportation department to think about, given sort of the geography of the city, and how to link some of the active transportation choices to transit options as well. So I think there's a really big opportunity there to think about how do we provide more frequent service to areas that need access to transit, and how do we link that to those active transportation choices as well.
Michael, how can the cycle routes in the ActiveTO plan and future cycle routes address some of the some of what that data shows us about where COVID is in the city?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that with the plan that was approved at council last week, in terms of new temporary protected bike lanes across the city, those 40 kilometers, none of them are in that that in Etobicoke. None of them are in those like hotspots in the northwest corner of the city. And I think Amanda's right. Bikes alone aren't going to solve the transportation issues across the city. Transit will continue to be a really important role, and active transportation can, sort of hand in glove work really well with that. But for that to work, people also need active transportation options, and ensuring there are, like in a lot of places in Etobicoke, Scarborough, and North York, people are sort of choosing to ride on the sidewalks rather than ride on arterial roads. And as the number of people who go out and as we start reopening happens, there's potential there for more conflicts on sidewalks and on roads between multiple road users trying to move around. So it's definitely something that's going to need to be addressed in the short term and also in the long term as we pivot towards recovery. The other piece I wanted to say as well, like as we were talking about the major road closures on Lakeshore West, Lakeshore East, and on Bayview, if you're living in the northwest corner of the city or in Upper Scarborough, those areas may not be places you can easily access. So it's great that we're creating that space for recreation, for people to safely physically distance, for families to get out and really get that exercise for physical and mental health. But it does speak to needing more areas to be able to do this to ensure that we're reaching all parts of the city.
Barbara, this neighborhood level data, how is that factoring into decisions that your department is making about ActiveTO and other programs?
So data on equity is absolutely built into the foundations of the 10-year cycling network plan. And we actually use equity-based data and data about vulnerable users in most of the longer range planning that we do. And so from looking at the cycling network plan that I think, never enough, but still does have much more broader coverage citywide and does address many of the neighborhoods that are being the hardest hit by COVID right now in terms of where people live. We definitely took into account factoring the transit routes and trying to provide some relief, especially in the short term from transit. And then I just want to say that the agitation in neighborhoods about the addition of bike lanes does not end because we're trying to do things during a pandemic. And so we really focused on trying to get connectivity to the network that we already have mapped out, that we've had a lot of public engagement around. And also it was of not a lot of value for us right now to put the initial legs of this in place in 6 months' time. It had to happen within the next month, and the speed of the implementation was as critical, I think. So trying to get some major connectivity and really focusing on the hospitals and healthcare workers on university being, I think, a pretty significant step forward, as well as trying to really get the Bloor corridor, from end to end connected. We have some areas in the suburban communities, not enough by any means. And I think we're still, keep those cards and letters coming, as well as just us doing our job and going out and identifying those places where people really need that space to get out for recreation and local trips. So we continue to work on that, and we continue to engage with the counselors and the BIAs and resident groups. And we have lots and lots of recommendations to roll out more quiet streets and more ActiveTO opportunities.
Barbara mentioned the agitation that sometimes happens or always happens when we talk about bike infrastructure being implemented in neighborhoods. I want to address that head on. Last week we had a pretty overwhelming council vote and a relatively pleasant debate about this ActiveTO bike plan, but we still had some letters from some groups opposing it. The Bloor Yorkville BIA said bike lanes threaten the future of all parades, including the Santa Claus parade. The Greektown BIA said it would be very negative for their business. Property management company on the Danforth claimed that in over 40 years of being on the Danforth, we have never seen a biker stop by and visit a shop and spend money there or eat at a restaurant, which is very confusing because I don't know how cyclists are surviving without food. These kinds of letters just seem inevitable, but I am curious about strategies for how we, address some of this stuff head on. We have some stats that we can show about, where we've actually looked at where bike lanes have gone in. Oh, there we go. So this is the Bloor Street bike lanes in the Annex and Koreatown neighborhoods. And what it showed was more customers on Bloor after the bikeway and spending more money. But, so this kind of data exists. And in all of the cases I've seen, it's pretty positive. But we haven't really seen this break through to the point where we're not getting that kind of agitation, as Barbara called it. So I want to start with Michael on this one. Cycle Toronto, advocates for bike lanes, deals with this kind of opposition. What's the most effective message you can give to businesses who express this kind of concern?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up those stats, Matt, and I encourage everyone to look at them, because if you look at the Bloor Street pilot that was done several years ago, which Barbara can probably correct me on this, must be the most studied bike lane implementation in North America, if not the world. And the data there suggests, well, not suggests, does show that bike lanes are at worst neutral and at best a positive to shopping in neighborhoods. And I think one of the things that's really exciting that we're seeing with some of the ActiveTO implementations is what's going to be happening on Danforth, and about how those bike lanes are really going to be part of sort of encouraging people to shop local, this idea of a destination Danforth, and encouraging some interaction with the with cafe space and that piece as well. You know, I think with a lot of people will be working from home for the foreseeable future. A lot of people will be sort of exploring and living within their local neighborhoods a little bit more. And a network for, that provides safe, active transportation really encourages people to shop at local businesses, to support their favorite restaurants, to go to cafes and do that sort of thing, and can really be a very powerful economic engine to help stimulate our recovery.
Definitely. Raktim, in your research, have you looked at all or have any thoughts on the business opposition, the economic impacts of bike lanes?
Well, as Michael was mentioning, that there's research that have repeatedly shows that the reality might not reflect what is perceived by many of the BIAs around driving and expenditure on main streets. But I mean, what I have found from my work, I mean, you mentioned, Matt, that bike infrastructure is always political, but I'd like to argue that it's not necessarily the bike, but it's the automobile that is political. So bike only becomes political when it is in a fight for road space with the automobiles. And I think in this particular context, as we are recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that is different now than before is that bicycle infrastructure is now being seen as an alternative to using transit rather than as an alternative to driving, which is probably why it was easier to get a buy-in from a lot of people, including the councillors who would otherwise be in opposition to a large-scale rollout of bike infrastructure implementation. So I just wanted to kind of draw our attention to that in this particular context. But at the same time, I do believe that in most of these places, if not all of these places where bike infrastructure are going in, there has already been demand for biking. On Danforth, for example, over the last 3 years, bike ridership has gone up by about 3 percentage points every year, which is a lot of growth. So I think as these facilities come in, more and more people would continue to use that. And the benefit of that is that 6 months from now, it'd be very difficult to kind of say that, well, those were temporary and we want to go back to where we were. Because as people start using them, it'd kind of justify these facilities by themselves. So that's something that I think is going to happen.
Barbara, normally with a bike lane, there's a series of consultation meetings that happen before people see it on the street. With the ActiveTO stuff, we're moving very rapidly from council approval to implementation. Do you think this kind of approach might actually tell us something about how much consultation is necessary, when to do the consultation? What are your thoughts on this process versus the typical process?
I think generally, I think the mayor said it best about the Bloor Street, the initial pilot on Bloor Street, where he was out and walking that corridor quite a bit in the beforehand when businesses and some BIAs were quite agitated. Not all of them, but many of them. And he lives in the vicinity, so he goes back now, and we've also engaged with those businesses now, and it's not an issue for them. In fact, they see the benefit. We see some positive response. I won't say that everybody's positive all the time, because can't make everybody happy, but in terms of the modification to their business and the change that they thought was going to put them out of business never materialized. I've been involved in lots of complete streets projects here and in the States, and I've never seen it go any other way other than lots of consultation, lots of agitation by the business community and others to start with. And then as long as the city, I think, is flexible about managing the challenges with implementation and making modifications where things are really not working and really listening to pain points and trying to correct them, I think it's best to try to get things in quickly so that people get a little less agitated about what the unknown change is going to be. But consultation is still, it's really critical. I mean, Amanda will tell you, like we have to still do, you have to consult on the big plan, you have to consult on the individual neighborhood-based work, you have to do the, business by business. There's a lot of my staff on this webinar. Those folks are intrepid, man. They go door to door and talk to everybody multiple times. So I just think it's really critical and important that we continue to consult, but it doesn't, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how much change we have to make after we do installations. And I would also say that the consultation happened as part of the cycling network plan. That was just adopted last year. And the team who did consultation on that, both the public consultation unit and city transportation, were out in neighborhoods all over the city, sitting at lots of different tables with, a full range of our community members and getting feedback and input from them. So doesn't happen any differently in my experience. Sorry.
Amanda, your name was invoked. Tell us about consultation and why it's important.
Well, I think Barbara hit the nail on the head when she said that, if the city is responsive and adaptive and willing to listen to the pinch points and pain points, I think that's a really great sort of mantra to take into any kind of engagement exercise. I think what's interesting, when we did the Danforth pop-up last summer, our focus was really trying to show a different kind of engagement around thinking about complete streets and safer streets, and actually giving people an experience that they could feel when we, very quickly in 24 hours took 2 curb lanes and reallocated it to physically separated bicycle lanes, expanded pedestrian space, some pop-up parklets. And I think what we found was in that process, we were able to engage with a lot more diverse representation of community members than we would have if you have sort of, the standard kind of traditional public consultation where you ask people to come to you at City Hall, or in this kind of, and I know that the city has done a lot to improve this process and work with a lot of partners to make it more accessible, but we still do tend to think of consultation as this form of, we invite people to come in. We tend to get, not a very representative sample of the city. We don't get a lot of people who are, those essential workers who are working multiple jobs. We don't get a lot of racialized communities out to those public meetings. So I think what we were trying to show with the Danforth pop-up is that if you bring the experience to the community themselves and give them a chance to interact with it, and think kind of in a more unconventional way around how to engage community, I think the response you get is a lot more positive. And I think, with this rapid rollout of ActiveTO, as long as the city is willing to be very responsive and create those feedback loops, they can adjust. I think it's a great way to actually engage people very tangibly in kind of reclaiming parts of their streets. Whether it's through the Quiet Street program where they're interacting in a totally new way in one of the most intimate public spaces right outside their doors, or whether it's having the first experience of, riding. I took my kids to Lakeshore. They've never had the experience of riding on Lakeshore before ever in their life, as many other Torontonians as well. So if you actually give people that experience, our our experience shows us that they're a lot more open-minded to change, because I think, people fear change and fear the unexpected. And so I think this is an interesting opportunity for the city to get more engagement on the topic and also be adaptive and responsive as we hear feedback.
Speaking of the unexpected, we've flown through our time here. I want to ask one more question to the panel before we get to the Q&A. I'm going to combine the last two questions we had. We do have a map of the not the ActiveTO, but the kind of ActiveTO-like installations in cities across the world. There's a whole bunch of them in North America and Europe and Australia, South America. We've really seen a lot of cities step up and realize, okay, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but there's things we can do to create more space for people on our streets. So I'm curious to know from all of you, when you look at other cities and what they've done, are there things that you think Toronto should adapt? And also, when you think ahead about the future of ActiveTO and the future of complete streets and bike infrastructure and pedestrian realm in Toronto, how do things look for you post-pandemic? Are you optimistic about the changes that we've seen now sticking around as we go forward? I want to start this one off with, we might as well start with Barbara Gray. Barbara, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, thank goodness for the NACTO network. That group spun up pretty quickly a COVID response discussion across all the NACTO cities. And so we've been in very close touch learning from all the great work that others have been doing. And certainly many of the things that we're doing here, in different measure, different, permutations, but certainly all good ideas are being rolled out in many, many cities in North America and as well as, overseas. So I think as things change, there's cities that are ahead of us in the pandemic response and impact, and there's cities that are still to follow. And so I think we have an ongoing kind of role and responsibility to continue to stay connected and learn from what they're seeing on the ground and adapt as we can. And in terms of what comes next, I mean, we hear from lots of people that when they come back to the office, there's going to be a lot more driving, and we're going to see a huge increase in people in cars. I think there's going to be a range of things that happen as things start to open up again. I think Toronto has learned that it can telework. What a great benefit. Now, maybe not 5 days a week or 7 days a week, but certainly a number of days a week. Classic transportation demand management, shifting time of day, trying to use home office space as a way to try to manage congestion in the city. So I would hope that some of the great things we learned through this work in ActiveTO we would keep around, or we'd modify them to sort of come back to a more normal or regular kind of street environment. But I still think there are things that we can do that would help to keep in place the pieces of our streetscape now that we're able to take advantage of with fewer cars on the road that we would like to see carry on into the future. So that's my hopeful last word on that subject.
Like hope. Amanda, 880 Cities looks at cities all over the world pretty constantly. Your thoughts on things that we should be co-opting and your feeling about ActiveTO into the post-pandemic future?
Well, first I want to say, I am generally a very optimistic person, so I always feel very optimistic about change in cities, and I think that the cities that are showing great leadership in this moment and being able to sort of adapt amid a really uncertain and rapidly changing situation. I mean, it's been, I think, really fantastic to see around the world cities and their leadership really sort of coming to this moment and responding in a very thoughtful way, including Toronto. I think, looking at cities around the world, there's this numbers game that often happens, this city's done this many miles and this city's, and I think that is important, but it is one data point. And I think what I really appreciate about, to point out one program is Oakland's Slow Street model, which has been lauded as a great program where they've initiated a lot of these. It's very similar to the Quiet Streets program here in Toronto. But what I love about Oakland is not only that it was, covering 20% of their residential streets, but actually they got pushback from residents saying this is actually not a very equitable approach. This is not actually addressing what communities, they had a similar kind of reaction. There's communities, predominantly low-income communities, communities of color, that were like, this is actually not responding to what we need. We need to be accessing our groceries. We need access to COVID-19 testing sites, and the city responded. And so they responded with, they called the Essential Places program. I think that's a great example because it's showing a lot of empathetic leadership, which is what we need in this moment in cities, and a responsive leadership.
Raktim, any thoughts on the Toronto's sort of place in the worldwide movement towards this kind of thing during the pandemic, and also your feelings about the future? Are you also an optimist?
Yes, I'd like to think so. I mean, I think Toronto is taking a cautious approach in rolling out this ActiveTO, which is not a bad thing. As Barbara was mentioning, that after people start coming back to work in fall or soon after, we can either think short term and try to accommodate a short to medium term change in travel behavior and start planning for cars and whatnot. Or we can take this opportunity to do things that can bring long-term changes in people's behavior. And being strategic and in proposing infrastructure in the right places where things would be theirs to stay, I think that is the right thing to do. But at the same time, I wanted to kind of, because we are almost toward the end of our session, I wanted to bring us back to where we started, is that we need to recognize that there's a large social and special inequity in how all these are being rolled out, and we should not lose sight of that. We should continuously keep thinking about, as the city starts to grow this program, how can we be strategic about bringing things such as quiet streets, such as bike infrastructure to our inner suburban communities, which are one hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, and also where the latent demand for walking, biking perhaps is less. So it'd be hard to get a buy-in in those communities. So how do we create an environment where we're enabling sustainable transportation practices, and at the same time we're creating healthy and resilient communities in the longer term? That is a big challenge, I think, that the city has to face going forward. And I think we should not lose sight of that for a moment.
Michael, I'll give you the last word. Cycle Toronto called the vote last week, I think, the largest installation of bike infrastructure in Toronto's history. That's got to make you pretty happy. But when you look at what the rest of the world is doing, is it enough? And do you feel like this is change that will stick around?
I mean, it's definitely a historic first step to really addressing the need for an active transportation network and an equitable active transportation network across the city. I think, the protests that we're seeing in Canada and around the world, and in Toronto specifically, do sort of highlight that, when we talk about safe streets from the position of white privilege, it means a very different thing if you're Indigenous, Black, or a person of color. And that these strategies do need to address that as well. It's, just because we have an active transportation network in the suburbs, if people don't feel comfortable using it or don't feel safe using it, it's still not really addressing sort of key problems. And so we think this is an important first phase. And if this is sort of giving us the kind of community and business and political buy-in to accelerate the next phase, I think that's a really great and important thing. And so that we can address these kind of issues about, whether it's staff capacity, and whether it's the ability to do this kind of consultation in a COVID world. Barbara sort of talked about how traditionally the city has undergone consultation a lot of those toolkits may not be available to us in the coming weeks and months. So ensuring we're still able to have that kind of political engagement so that people feel connected to the decisions that are happening in their streets and their neighborhood, and that we're able to move forward and just make a more livable city for everyone.
That's great. And that brings my questions to a close, but I think Claire has some questions from the audience and is going to pop right in like that.
Yes, maybe too many questions from the audience. We had 24 questions and we have 1 minute. So I think we'll try to go 5 minutes over time so that we can hopefully answer 2 of these. And panelists, I just encourage you to be brief and snappy in your responses. One question that we received from Dylan Reed. Dylan says, one thing missing from ActiveTO is extended expansions of sidewalks on main streets for pedestrian transportation, which have been implemented in other cities. And he asks, are there any plans to add those to ActiveTO? So maybe I'll just throw that one right to Barbara.
Sure. I mean, we've had some examples of that, like on the curb lane that we opened for additional pedestrian space adjacent to High Park. And I think we will certainly see more of that through ActiveTO, and also as we start to look at streetscapes with Main Street businesses through the Cafe Patio program that we're launching now.
Awesome, thank you. And another question, there were a few related questions. We touched on this a little bit about transit and the use of cycling lanes as a release valve for transit lines. And a few questions that I'm kind of just going to blend together around Yonge Street and the absence of cycling lanes on Yonge Street in the ActiveTO plan. Questions around will they be coming, and kind of what should and will the decision-making process be around aligning cycling lanes with transit lines. So maybe I'll throw that one to Michael.
Well, I agree from Cycle Toronto's perspective, and as the mayor has himself said, that a lot of this cycling network plan acceleration is about that transit relief valve. And it's great to see that stretch of University from Bloor to Adelaide getting bike lanes. It'll really help create a kind of really important north-south connectivity downtown, provide people with options to be able to get to those hospitals. But the other side of Line 1, which is Yonge Street, currently doesn't have any bike lanes on it. There currently aren't any plans as part of the ActiveTO rollout. And it is the busiest subway in Canada. And you know, as we move towards recovery, it is something that will need to be addressed.
Any other comments on that? So my last question, and I'm hoping that you can all have a few words on this one, is around an anonymous attendee asked, what are the long-term effects of active transportation on the physical development of the city? And specifically, will we see a shift to more localized and self-contained neighborhoods? And I think this connects with some ideas that we had been discussing earlier around, you know, transportation networks within neighborhoods and ideas that have been going around the 15-minute city. So I think in terms of maybe looking at the next 6 months of recovery, is that a change that you anticipate happening, and how might this ActiveTO plan address that? Maybe I'll start with Raktim on that one.
I do think that that's going to happen, at least in the short to medium terms. And I mentioned this at the beginning, that my guess is that we would see an increase in localized trips to shops, to community destinations. And I think what needs to be done here is to take that opportunity and you know, use it as a travel demand management strategy to modify, mediate people's long-term behavior. If we do nothing, my guess is that in the next 6 months to 1 year, people would do things locally, then slowly they'd adjust to their previous life. But if we are smart, and if you're being strategic in enabling those local trips, making those really easy, really convenient, then some of these people would continue to do their things locally, which is what exactly the basic travel demand management concepts suggest. So there's an opportunity there, and we should take that as a city.
Maybe I'll give Amanda the last word on that one.
Oh, wow. Okay. I think there's a tendency to be a bit like predictive, and I think Raktim is absolutely right. We need to be proactive and not sort of thinking about what is the future of the city, but actually as a community, as citizens, what is the future we want it? What is the future we want? And really be proactive about building that in. And I think there's a lot of advantages to doing a 15-minute city, and we know this has been like lauded for many years around urban planning, good urban planning. So if this is the future we want, let's be proactive and do it.
Okay, thank you all so much. I'm sorry, we really do have to wrap up, but I thank you so much for this incredible conversation. It was really interesting for me, and I hope it was for others as well. Thank you so much, Matt, for being a very capable moderator. That was awesome. And to Raktim and Barbara and Amanda and Michael, thank you so much for your time and joining us today. To all our participants, the recording of the webinar will be available on the City Building Institute's website shortly. And there you can also find information about our next webinars in this series. We've just confirmed our next topic, which will be on the Yonge Street redesign and its future in the context of COVID-19. That's scheduled for July 2nd, and so we'll be sending out information and a registration link on that shortly, so please stay tuned. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Happy to have had you, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.